Hey team, this is a piece called Not a Workers' State and Not a Bourgeois State, by Leon Trotsky. It's from November 25th, 1937. This was a primary source material from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. Let's get started. Political form and social content. Comrades Burnham and Carter have placed a fresh question mark over the class character of the Soviet state. The answer which they give is, in my opinion, completely erroneous. But inasmuch as these comrades do not attempt, as do some ultra-leftists, to substitute shrieking for scientific analysis, we can and should seriously discuss with Burnham and Carter this exceptionally important question. Burnham and Carter do not forget that the main difference between the USSR and the contemporary bourgeois state finds its expression in the powerful development of the productive forces as a result of the change in the form of ownership. They further admit that, quote, the economic structure as established by the October Revolution remains basically unchanged, end quote. Burnham and Carter deduce from this that it is the duty of the Soviet and world proletariat to defend the USSR from imperialist attacks. In this, there is complete agreement between Burnham and Carter and us. But no matter how great the degree of our agreement, it by no means covers the whole issue. Though Burnham and Carter do not solidarize themselves with the ultra-lefts, they nevertheless consider that the USSR has stopped being a workers' state, quote, in the traditional sense, sense given to this term by Marxism, end quote. But since, quote, the economic structure, still remains basically unchanged, end quote, the USSR has not become a bourgeois state. Burnham and Carter at the same time deny, and for this we can only congratulate them, that the bureaucracy is an independent class. The result of these inconsistent assertions is the conclusion, the very one the Stalinists draw, that the Soviet state in general is not an organization of class domination. What then is it? Thus we have a new attempt at revising the class theory of the state. We are not, it goes without saying, fetishists. Should new historical facts demand a revision of the theory, we would not stop at doing so. But the lamentable experience of the old revisionists should in any case imbue us with a salutary caution. We should 10 times over weigh in our minds the old theory and the new facts before we attempt to formulate a new doctrine. Burnham and Carter themselves remark in passing that in its dependence on objective and subjective conditions, the rule of the proletariat, quote, is able to express itself in a number of different governmental forms, end quote. For clarity, we will add, either through an open struggle of different parties within the Soviets, or through the monopoly of one party, or even through a factual concentration of power in the hands of a single person. Of course, personal dictatorship is a symptom of the greatest danger to the regime, but at the same time, it is, under certain conditions, the only means by which to save that regime. The class nature of the state is consequently determined not by its political forms, but by its social content, i.e., by the character of the forms of property and productive relations which the given state guards and defends. In principle, Burnham and Carter do not deny this. If they nevertheless refuse to see in the USSR a workers' state, it is due to 2 reasons, one of which is economic and the other political in character. Quote, during the past year, they write, quote, the bureaucracy has definitively entered the road of destruction of the planned and nationalized economy, end quote. Has only, quote, entered the road, end quote, ? Further, we read that the course of development, quote, brings the bureaucracy into ever-increasing and deepening conflict with the needs and interests of the nationalized economy, end quote. Only, quote, brings it, end quote, ? The contradiction between the bureaucracy and the economy was observed before this, but for the past year, quote, the actions of the bureaucracy are actively sabotaging the plan and disintegrating the state monopoly, end quote. Only, quote, disintegrating, end quote, ? Hence not disintegrated, ? As stated above, the second contention has a political character. Quote, The concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat is not primarily an economic but predominantly a political category, ... All forms, organs, and institutions of the class rule of the proletariat are now destroyed, which is to say that the class rule of the proletariat is destroyed, end quote. After hearing about the, quote, different forms, end quote, of the proletarian regime, this second contention, taken by itself, appears unexpected. Of course, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not only, quote, predominantly, end quote, but wholly and fully a, quote, political category, end quote. However, this very politics is only concentrated economics. The domination of the social democracy in the state and in the Soviets, Germany 1918 to 1919, had nothing in common with the dictatorship of the proletariat, as much as it left bourgeois property inviolable. But the regime which guards the expropriated and nationalized property from the imperialist is, independent of political forms, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Burnham and Carter, quote, in general, end quote, as it were, admit this. They therefore have recourse to combining the economic with the political contention. The bureaucracy, they say, has not only definitively deprived the proletariat of political power, but has driven the economy into a blind alley. If in the previous period the bureaucracy, with all the bureaucracy's reactionary features, played a comparatively progressive role, the bureaucracy has now definitively become a reactionary factor. In this reasoning, there is a healthy kernel which is in complete conformity with all former evaluations and prognoses of the Fourth International. We have more than once spoken of the fact that, quote, enlightened absolutism has played a progressive role in the development of the bourgeoisie, only afterward to become a brake upon this development. The conflict resolved itself, as is known, in revolution. In laying the groundwork for socialist economy, we wrote, quote, enlightened absolutism, end quote, can play a progressive role only during an incomparably shorter period. This prognosis is clearly confirmed before our very eyes. Deceived by its own successes, the bureaucracy expected to attain ever bigger coefficients of economic growth. Meanwhile, it ran up against an acute crisis in the economy which became one of the sources of its present panic and its mad repressions. Does this then mean that the development of productive forces in the USSR has already stopped? We would not venture to make such an assertion. The creative possibilities of nationalized economy are so great that the productive forces, in spite of the bureaucratic brake upon them, can develop for a period of years, although at a considerably more moderate rate than heretofore. Along these lines, it is scarcely possible at the moment to make an exact forecast. In any case, the political crisis, which is rendering the bureaucracy asunder, is considerably more dangerous for the bureaucracy today than the perspective of a stoppage in the development of the productive forces. For the sake of simplifying the question, however, let us grant that the bureaucracy has already become an absolute brake upon the economic development. But does this fact in itself mean that the class nature of the USSR has changed, or that the USSR is devoid of any kind of class nature? Here, it seems to me, is the chief mistake of our comrades. Up until the First World War, bourgeois society developed bourgeois society's productive forces. Only during the past quarter of the century has the bourgeoisie become an absolute brake upon economic development. Does this mean that bourgeois society has ceased being bourgeois? No. It only means that bourgeois society has become a decaying bourgeois society. In a number of countries, the preservation of bourgeois property is possible only through the establishment of a fascist regime. In other words, the bourgeoisie is devoid of all forms and means of the bourgeoisie's own direct political domination and must use an intermediary. Does this mean that the state has stopped being bourgeois? To the extent that fascism, with fascism's barbaric methods, defends private property and the means of production, to that extent the state remains bourgeois under the fascist rule. We do not at all intend to give our analogy an all-inclusive meaning. Nevertheless, it demonstrates that the concentration of power in the hands of the bureaucracy and even the retardation of the development of the productive forces by themselves still do not change the class nature of society and its state. Only the intrusion of a revolutionary or counter-revolutionary force in property relations can change the class nature of the state. Footnote. The London New Leader, under the editorship of Fenner Brockway, I believe that Fenner Brockway is a left socialist person. Writes in an editorial dated November 12th of this year, quote, "The Independent Labor Party does not accept the Trotskyist view that the economic foundations of socialism in Soviet Russia have been destroyed," end quote. "What can one say about these people? They do not understand the thoughts of others because they do not have any of their own. They can only sow confusion in the minds of workers." Leon Trotsky, end footnote. But does not history really know of cases of class conflict between the economy and the state? It does. After the, quote, Third Estate seized power, society for a period of several years still remained feudal. In the first months of Soviet rule, the proletariat reigned on the basis of a bourgeois economy. In the field of agriculture, the dictatorship of the proletariat operated for a number of years on the basis of petty bourgeois economy. To a considerable degree, it does so even now. Should a bourgeois counter-revolution succeed in the USSR, the new government for a lengthy period would have to base itself upon the nationalized economy. But what does such a type of temporary conflict between the economy and the state mean? It means a revolution, or a counter-revolution. The victory of one class over another signifies that it will reconstruct the economy in the interest of the victors. But such a dichotomous condition, which is a necessary stage in every social overturn, has nothing in common with the theory of a classless society, which, in the absence of a real boss, is being exploited by a clerk, by the bureaucracy. Norm and fact. It is the substitution of a subjective, quote, normative, end quote, method in place of an objective dialectical approach to the question, which renders it difficult for many comrades to arrive at a correct sociological appraisal of the USSR. Not without reason do Burnham and Carter say that the Soviet Union could not be considered a worker state, quote, in the traditional sense given to this term by Marxism, end quote. This simply means that the USSR does not correspond to the norms of a worker state as set forth in our program. On this score there can be no disagreement. Our program has counted upon a progressive development of the worker state, and by that token upon its gradual withering away. But history, which does not always act, quote, according to a program, end quote, has confronted us with the process of a degenerating worker state. But does this mean that a worker state coming into conflict with the demands of our program has ceased thereby to be a worker state? A liver poisoned by malaria does not correspond to a normal type of liver, but it does not because of that cease to be a liver. For the understanding of its nature, anatomy and physiology are not sufficient. Pathology, too, is necessary. Of course, it is much easier upon seeing the diseased liver to say, quote, "This object is not to my liking," end quote, and to turn one's back upon it. But a physician cannot permit himself such a luxury. Depending upon the conditions of the disease itself, the resulting deformation of the organ, he must have a recourse either to therapeutic treatment, quote, reforms, or to surgery, quote, revolution. But to be able to do this, he must first of all understand that the deformed organ is a sick liver and not something else. Let us take a more familiar analogy, that between a worker state and a trade union. From the point of view of our program, the trade union should be an organization of class struggle. What then should be our attitude to the American Federation of Labor? At its head stand manifest agents of the bourgeoisie. Upon all essential questions, Messrs. Green, Wool, and Company carry out a political line directly opposed to the interest of the proletariat. We can extend the analogy and say that if until the appearance of the CIO, the AFL accomplished somewhat progressive work, now that the chief content of its activity is embodied in a struggle against the more progressive or less reactionary tendencies of the CIO, Green's apparatus has definitely become a reactionary factor. This would be completely correct, but the AFL does not because of this cease to be an organization of the trade unions. The class character of the state is determined by its relation to the forms of property and the means of production. The character of a workers' organization, such as a trade union, is determined by its relation to the distribution of national income. The fact that Green and Company defend private property and the means of production characterizes them as bourgeois. Should these gentlemen in addition defend the income of the bourgeoisie from attacks on the part of the workers? Should they conduct a struggle against strikes, against the raising of wages, against help to the unemployed? Then we would have an organization of scabs and not a trade union. However, Green and Company, in order not to lose their base, must within certain limits lead the struggle of the workers for an increase or at least against a diminution of their share of the national income. This objective symptom is sufficient in all important cases to permit us to draw a line of demarcation between the most reactionary trade union and an organization of scabs. Thus we are duty-bound not only to carry on work in the American Federation of Labor, but to defend the American Federation of Labor, the KKK, and the like. The function of Stalin, like the function of Green, has a dual character. Stalin serves the bureaucracy and thus the world bourgeoisie, but Stalin cannot serve the bureaucracy without defending the social foundation which the bureaucracy exploits in its own interest. To that extent does Stalin defend nationalized property from imperialist attacks and from too impatient and avaricious layers of the bureaucracy itself. However, Stalin carries through this defense with methods that prepare the general destruction of Soviet society. It is exactly because of this that the Stalinist clique must be overthrown. But it is the revolutionary proletariat who must overthrow it. The proletariat cannot subcontract this work to the imperialists. In spite of Stalin, the proletariat defends the USSR from imperialist attacks. Historical development has accustomed us to the most varied kind of trade unions, militant, reformist, revolutionary, reactionary, liberal, and Catholic. Is it otherwise with the worker state? Such a phenomenon we see for the first time. That accounts for our inclination to approach the USSR exclusively from the point of view of the norms of the revolutionary program. Meanwhile, the worker state is an objective historical fact which is being subjected to the influence of different historical forces and can, as we see, come into full contradiction with, quote, traditional, end quote, norms. Comrades Burnham and Carter are completely correct when they say that Stalin and company, by their politics, serve the international bourgeoisie. This is correct, but this correct thought must be established in the correct conditions of time and place. Hitler also serves the bourgeoisie. However, between the functions of Hitler and Stalin, there is a difference. Hitler defends the bourgeois forms of property. Stalin adapts the interest of the bureaucracy to the proletarian forms of property. The same Stalin in Spain, i.e. on the soil of a bourgeois regime, executes the function of Hitler. In their political methods, they generally differ little from one another. The juxtaposition of the different social roles of the one and the same Stalin in the USSR and in Spain demonstrates equally well that the bureaucracy is not an independent class but the tool of classes, and that it is impossible to define the social nature of a state by the virtue or villainy of the bureaucracy. The assertion that the bureaucracy of a worker state has a bourgeois character must appear not only unintelligible but completely senseless to people stamped with a formal cast of mind. However, chemically pure types of state never exist and do not exist in general. The semi-feudal Prussian monarchy executed the most important tasks of the bourgeoisie, but executed them in its own manner, i.e. in a feudal, not a Jacobin style. In Japan, we observe even today an analogous correlation between the bourgeois character of the state and the semi-feudal character of the ruling caste. But all this does not hinder us from clearly differentiating between a feudal and a bourgeois society. True, one can raise the objection that the collaboration of feudal and bourgeois forces is immeasurably more easily realized than the collaboration of bourgeois and proletarian forces, inasmuch as the first instance presents a case of two forms of class exploitation. This is completely correct. But a worker state does not create a new society in one day. Marx wrote that in the first period of a worker state, the bourgeois norms of distribution are still preserved. About this, see The Revolution Betrayed, the section, quote, Socialism and the State, end quote. One has to weigh well and think this thought out to the end. The worker state itself, as a state, is necessary exactly because the bourgeois norms of distribution still remain in force. Again, like I said in other articles, it seems like what would get it seems again like Trotsky is making some serious confusions about the content of the Gotha program in terms of bourgeois norms of distribution. What that means is that work is consumption goods are distributed on the basis of need. If the socialist society was based on non-bourgeois norms of distribution, he uses the concept of like a bourgeois norms as like an analogy, in the sense that there's still a sort of quid pro quo relationship between society and individuals, in the sense as people must work to earn their bread. So equivalent is given for equivalent, in the sense of labor vouchers, for instance. You put so and so much hours of work into the social body, and then you get so and so quantity of consumer goods for that labor time. That's what bourgeois norms of distribution means. Not the I don't know, nothing comparable to the inequality that exists in capitalism. Not really explaining that well, but I don't need to. These are just my marginalia. This means that even the most revolutionary bureaucracy is to a certain degree a bourgeois organ in the workers' state. Of course, the degree of this bourgeoisification and the original tendency of development bears decisive significance. If the workers' state loses its bureaucratization and gradually falls away, this means that its development marches along the road of socialism. On the contrary, if the bureaucracy becomes ever more powerful, authoritative, privileged, and conservative, this means that in the worker state the bourgeois tendencies grow at the expense of the socialist. And in other words, inner contradiction, which to a certain degree is lodged in the worker state from the first days of its rise, do not diminish as the quote, norm end quote, demands, but increases. However, so long as that contradiction is not passed from the sphere of distribution into the sphere of production, has not blown up nationalized property and planned economy, the state remains a workers' state. Lenin had already said 15 years ago, quote, our state is a workers' state, but with bureaucratic deformations, end quote. In that period, bureaucratic deformation represented a direct inheritance of the bourgeois regime, and in that sense appeared as a mere survival of the past. Under the pressure of unfavorable historical conditions, however, the bureaucratic, quote, survival, end quote, received new sources of nourishment and became a tremendous historical factor. It is exactly because of this that we now speak of the degeneration of the workers' state. This degeneration, as the present orgy of Bonapartist terror shows, has approached a crucial point. That which was a, quote, bureaucratic deformation, end quote, is at the present moment preparing to devour the workers' state without leaving any remains, and on the ruins of nationalized property to spawn a new propertied class. Such a possibility is drawn extremely near, but all this is only a possibility, and we do not intend beforehand to bow before it. The USSR as a workers' state does not correspond to the, quote, traditional norm. This does not signify that the USSR is not a workers' state. Neither does this signify that the norm has been found false. The, quote, norm counted upon the complete victory of the international proletarian revolution. The USSR is only a partial and mutilated expression of a backward and isolated workers' state. Idealistic, ultimately, quote, purely, end quote, normative thinking wishes to construct the world in its own image and simply turns away from phenomena which are not to its liking. Sectarians, i.e. people who are revolutionary only in their own imagination, guide themselves by empty idealistic norms. They say, quote, these unions are not to our liking, we will not join them, this workers' state is not to our liking, we will not defend it, end quote. Each time they promise to begin history anew. They will construct, don't you see, an ideal worker state when God places in their hands an ideal party and ideal unions, but until this happy moment arrives, they will, as much as possible, pout their lips at reality. A very big pout, that is the supreme expression of sectarian, quote, revolutionaryism, end quote. Purely, quote, historical, reformist Menshevik passive conservative thinking busies itself with justifying, as Marx expressed it, today's swinishness by yesterday's swinishness. Representatives of this kind enter into mass organizations and dissolve themselves there. The contemptible, quote, friends, end quote, of the USSR adapt themselves to the vileness of the bureaucracy, invoking the, quote, historical, end quote, conditions. In opposition to these two casts of mind, dialectical thinking, Marxist Bolshevik, takes phenomenon in their objective development, at the same time finds in the internal contradictions of this development a basis for the realization of its, quote, norms. It is, of course, necessary not to forget that we expect the programmatic norms to be realized only if they are the generalized expression of the progressive tendencies of the objective historical process itself. The programmatic definition of a union would sound approximately like this: an organization of workers of a trade or industry with the objective of, one, struggling against capitalism for the amelioration of the conditions of the workers; 2, participating in the revolutionary struggle for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie; 3, participating in the organization of economy on a socialist basis. If we compared this, quote, normative definition with the actual reality, we should find ourselves constrained to say there does not exist a single trade union in the world today. But such a counterposing of norm to fact, that is to say, of the generalized expression of the development to the particular manifestation of this same development, such a formal, ultimatistic, non-dialectical counterposing of program to reality is absolutely lifeless and does not open any road for the intervention of the Revolutionary Party. In the meantime, the existing opportunistic unions under the pressure of capitalist disintegration can, and given correct policies on our part in the unions, must approach our programmatic norms and play a progressive historical role. This is, of course, presupposes a complete change of leadership. It is necessary that the workers of the United States, England, France drive out Green, Citrine, Howe, and company. It is necessary that the Soviet workers drive out Stalin and company. If the proletariat drives out the Soviet bureaucracy in time, then the proletariat will still find the nationalized means of production and the basic elements of the planned economy after its victory. This means that it will not have to begin from the beginning. That is a tremendous advantage. Only radical dandies who are used to hopping carelessly from twig to twig can light-mindedly dismiss such a possibility. The socialist revolution is too tremendous and difficult a problem for one to light-mindedly wave one's hand at its inestimable material achievements and begin from the beginning. It is very good that comrades Burnham and Carter, in distinction from our French comrade Crépieux and others, do not forget the factor of the productive forces, and do not deny defense to the Soviet Union. Burnham and Carter are people who are affiliated with what will become the Workers' Party, oriented around Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman being a more dominant personality in the Socialist Workers' Party. So his name is kind of affiliated with the bureaucratic collectivist thesis, but there's other people who advocated for, such as, I think it's James Burnham and Joseph Carter are the first names, and the French Trotskyist Ivan Crépieux. These people also embrace something like a bureaucratic collectivist thesis. Crépieux, I think, represents something like a a third campus position coming from French Trotskyism. I'm not exactly sure about that. I think Crépieux went on to kind of like have a more dominant place within French Trotskyism. I think he might have. I think he might have been one of the leaders of the Parti Communiste Internationaliste, which is like the communist, which was like the main Trotskyist party in like late 40s France. And I don't know if he would have been leader if he did not accept the generator workers thesis. But it seems like in France, at least, there was like a lot of debate within that. I mean, that's where Castoriadis and the Four emerge as the, I can't remember how to say their name. Chalou mental tendency, I think it might be. I can't remember. But, yeah. Just some clarification, just some notes about like who these people are. Anyway, it's very good that comrades Burnham and Carter, in distinction from our French comrade Yvan Crépieux and others, do not forget the factor of the productive forces and do not deny defense to the Soviet Union. But this is completely insufficient. And what if the criminal leadership of the bureaucracy should paralyze the growth in the economy? Can it be possible that Comrade B and C in such a case will passively allow imperialism to destroy the social bases of the USSR? We are sure this is not the case. However, their non-Marxist definition of the USSR as neither a workers' nor a bourgeois state opens the door for all kinds of conclusions. That is why this definition must be categorically rejected. Simultaneously a ruling and an oppressed class. Quote, how can our political conscience not resent the fact, end quote, says the ultra-leftist, quote, that they want to force us to believe that in the USSR under Stalin's rule the proletariat is the, quote, ruling class, end quote, ... end quote. This assertion phrased in such an abstract manner can actually arouse our, quote, resentment. But the truth is that abstract categories necessary in the process of analysis are completely unfit for synthesis, which demands the utmost concreteness. The proletariat of the USSR is the ruling class in a backward country where there is still a lack of the most vital necessities of life. The proletariat of the USSR rules in a land consisting of only 1/12 part of humanity. Imperialism rules over the remaining 11/12. The rule of the proletariat, already maimed by the backwardness and poverty of the country, is doubly and triply deformed under the pressure of world imperialism. The organ of the rule of the proletariat, the state, becomes an organ for pressure from imperialism, diplomacy, army, foreign trade, ideas, and customs. The struggle for domination, considered on a historical scale, is not between the proletariat and bureaucracy, but between the proletariat and the world bourgeoisie. The bureaucracy is only the transmitting mechanism in this struggle. The bureaucracy is only the transmitting mechanism in this struggle. The struggle is not concluded. In spite of all the efforts on the part of Moscow clique to demonstrate its conservative reliability, the counter-revolutionary of politics in Spain, exclamation point. World imperialism does not trust Stalin, does not spare Stalin the most humiliating flicks, and is ready at the first favorable opportunity to overthrow him. Hitler, and therein lies his strength, simply more consistently and frankly expresses the attitude of the world bourgeoisie to the Soviet bureaucracy. For the bourgeoisie, fascist as well as democratic, isolated counter-revolutionary exploits of Stalin do not suffice. It needs a complete counter-revolution in the relations of property and the opening of the Russian market. So long as this is not the case, the bourgeoisie consider the Soviet state hostile to it, and it is right. The internal regime in the colonial and semi-colonial countries has a predominantly bourgeois character. But the pressure of foreign imperialism so alters and distorts the economic and political structures of these countries that the national bourgeoisie, even in the politically independent countries of South America, only partly reaches the height of a ruling class. The pressure of imperialism on backward countries does not, it is true, change their basic social character, since the oppressor and oppressed represent only different levels of development in one and the same bourgeois society. Nevertheless, the differences between England and India, Japan and China, the United States and Mexico is so big that we strictly differentiate between oppressor and oppressed bourgeois countries, and we consider it our duty to support the latter against the former. The bourgeoisie of colonial and semi-colonial countries is a semi-ruling, semi-oppressed class. The future of imperialism on the Soviet Union has as its aim the alteration of the very nature of Soviet society. The struggle today, peaceful tomorrow, military, concerns the forms of property. In its capacity as of a transmitting mechanism in this struggle, the bureaucracy leans now on the proletariat against imperialism, now on imperialism against the proletariat, in order to increase the bureaucracy's own power. At the same time, it mercilessly exploits its role as distributor of the meager necessities of life in order to safeguard its own well-being and power. By this token, the rule of the proletariat assumes an abridged, curved, distorted character. One can with full justification say that the proletariat, ruling in one backward and isolated country, still remains an oppressed class. The source of oppression is world imperialism, the mechanism of transmission of the oppression, the bureaucracy. If in the words, quote, a ruling and at the same time an oppressed class, end quote, there is a contradiction, then it flows not from the mistakes of thought, but from the contradiction in the very situation of the USSR. It is precisely because of this that we reject the theory of socialism in one country. The recognition of the USSR as a workers' state, not a type but a mutilation of a type, does not at all signify a theoretical and political amnesty for the Soviet bureaucracy. On the contrary, the Soviet bureaucracy's reactionary character is fully revealed only in the light of the contradiction between its anti-proletarian politics and the needs of a worker state. Only by posing the question in this manner does our exposure of the crimes of the Stalinist clique gain full motive force. The defense of the USSR means not only the supreme struggle against imperialism, but a preparation for the overthrow of the Bonapartist bureaucracy. The experience of the USSR shows how great are the possibilities lodged in the worker state and how great is its strength of resistance. But this experience also shows how powerful is the pressure of capitalism and capitalism's bureaucratic agency, how difficult it is for the proletariat to gain full liberation, and how necessary it is to educate and temper the new international in the spirit of irreconcilable revolutionary struggle. Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you got something out of listening to this.